My name is Steve,
And I'm Ben.
and we are balanced. What we're trying to do here is have some thoughtful discussions about some relevant, maybe sometimes what people say are hot topics or divisive topics that people talk about in today's society, and try to use logic, common sense, and balanced thought, not too far one way or the other, to see if we can find a way forward to make sense of things. I will say that I do lean a little bit towards the right, and I believe Ben would say he leans a little bit towards the left. So that's what we're doing here in the first episode. We're going to talk a little bit about things that are erasing history. So, is it right for people to change names of schools, streets, holidays, remove statues from public places, or relocate them because a portion of society finds the names of them offensive? I'm sure you're familiar with this, Ben, correct?
Correct.
What's the first impression that you have when you hear people having this, I'll say debate, even though sometimes these days it's more in an argument style that we hear on some of the TV shows and everything. So what's your first impression on that?
I would say that, yes, I do think it makes sense to make these kind of adjustments as society evolves. I think it's good to redefine our heroes and re-examine the types of figures that we celebrate. A top of mind example, and I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more and give some different examples, but something I've seen in the news a lot lately is the removal of Confederate statues. I have to say, I think that does make sense to me. I mean, these are symbols that exemplify our cultural values. And like I said, as the culture evolves, I think those symbols will have to evolve also.
The first impression I have when I hear something like this is I think, wow, do we want to erase things that would remind us of something, or sort of keep it separate from let's say the eyes and ears of our children these days that we're raising in society? So they'll always hear some generic nice name for a road, for a school, and not ask or question the history behind it. And I think I'm jumping huge here, and so I don't want you to jump down my throat here, but
that's okay.
I live here in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and we have a Holocaust museum. So we want to remember things. It's not, even if they're bad, and talk about them to make sure that we never forget, and therefore we never repeat. So that's the first impression, that when someone brings this argument up without me really thinking it through at all, I say we don't want to erase what's happened. So that's the first thing that I would say to that.
That's a great point. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned the Holocaust Museum, because I agree with you that you don't want to erase the history, but I think there's a big difference between the Holocaust Museum in DC, which I've been to, and I was going to say having a statue of Adolf Hitler, but I don't really know that that's an apt comparison or appropriate comparison.
It's interesting that you talked about the name Adolf Hitler, because I was just talking with someone who was stationed in Germany for 3 years with her family, someone I work with, and she had mentioned that there's, like, in Berlin, there's this bombed out church from World War II. And now I didn't research it. I have no reason not to believe her. But that it's there just as it was bombed out and destroyed. And it's the one thing they didn't rebuild, as a reminder. Hey, we did this. We have this history. And according to her, the children in Germany in schools, they cover history, and they talk about World War II. And I think they're owning it over there, is my understanding.
I would agree with that 100%. I was going to say, I think Germany does a really, really good job of not turning away from that very unfortunate period in their history. Because I've been to Germany a few times, and was in Munich and traveled around Austria a little bit. And I noticed there are many, many examples of that kind of cultural awareness. And one thing that I thought of when you were talking about the church is I remember seeing like some of the homes have little plaques in front of them, like in the sidewalk in front of the home, and it lists out the Jewish owners who had the house, and then the home was eventually, I guess, seized
Oh, wow.
by the state, right? But they keep these little symbols around in a way it's almost impossible to forget. And then the other side of that that's kind of interesting is that, you know, it's illegal in Germany to display anything with the Nazi, any kind of Nazi symbolism or anything like that at all. You don't see that kind of stuff anywhere. Not that I thought that you would go into a gift shop and there would be little swastika pins or something for sale, but I just thought it was very interesting that they very intentionally, there's a couple socialist museums you can go to where they have some of the old Nazi uniforms and stuff, but you don't see any of that symbolism.
Sure, I think they're a great example, but like now to talk back to what we're seeing here, some examples, like for instance, Chicago Lakeshore Drive there's efforts to rename it to the Jean Baptiste Pont du Sable. I'm probably not saying that. I don't speak French. Lakeshore Drive. So to me, and this was a Haitian-born Black pioneer and trader, and was supposedly the first non-Indigenous settler of the city of Chicago. So I think this is good. This is an example of a name change or name addition in order to honor someone, not because people are offended by the current name. So that's a change. But then we talk about going towards like Arlington County, Virginia. The board there is proposing to change the Robert E. Lee Highway to a John Langston Highway, which that was the first Black man to represent the state in the House of Representatives. In New Orleans, Caffin Avenue, which was named after a plantation owner who also was a slave owner. They want to change that to Fats Domino Avenue. These are just a few examples. Charlotte, North Carolina is renaming 9 streets linked to, and I don't have details here, but what they say are racist figures. And even in Toronto, a man named Henry Dundas, who was an obstructionist to when they were trying to, abolish slavery, this guy was like trying to say, no, we want to, we don't want to do that. We want to keep it. And there's been some street names and landmarks named after him. And they actually are renaming those. So there's monuments being moved, like you said, Confederate monuments, schools being renamed, parks. In fact, San Francisco, the Board of Education there renamed 44 schools with names they say are linked to racism, sexism, or slavery, to include Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Dianne Feinstein.
Oh, sorry, just so I'm clear in that example, they're changing the names to Abraham Lincoln, George Washington?
No, those are names that they're changing. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Dianne Feinstein are linked to racism, sexism, or slavery.
Dianne Feinstein is a contemporary figure.
Yes.
She had a school named after her, and they're changing it to something else?
They're changing it a bit because of some policies that she put forth and voted for, or when two lawmakers will co-sponsor a bill, and she might have been one of those co-sponsors to a bill that someone said, hey, within the meat of that bill is something that supports sexism or something like that. So and the reason that I brought that up is just because that is something right away you'd be like, that doesn't make sense, sort of extreme. So we've got a lot of examples: statues removed, Confederate figures, systemic racism, Christopher Columbus, genocide of Native Americans, all of these sort of reasons for people removing statues, to include statues of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Ulysses Grant, which was a Union general, Francis Scott Key. So
these are all slaveholders.
Yeah, these are all people that they say were at one point slaveholders. And then the Columbus Day, that's a one everybody knows about, changing that to Indigenous Peoples Day. There are several states that have changed the name from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and those being Alabama, Alaska, Hawaii, Idaho, Iowa, Louisiana, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Dakota, Vermont, Virginia, Wisconsin, and Washington, D.C. So that's a lot. Sorry for that long list. But
well, I got to say that one in particular, I'm totally cool with. I have a deep sympathy for the Native American people and that genocide. I don't think that it's taught responsibly or accurately in in the American culture. But that one, I'm totally on board with that one.
Well, okay. So I mean, those are some examples. I don't know whether I'm on board or not, or actually for some of this research I did to pull some of these examples, it did get my mind thinking here. So question one, does the renaming and or removal of these things that we've just been talking about, does that really erase history?
I would say it doesn't erase the history. I think that the history books, scholastic institutions, universities, Wikipedia, scholarly papers, the library, like that history is recorded, that history exists. Anyone can go and dig into that and look that up. I think what it does is it reinforces our definitions of right and wrong. It changes the figures that we consider worthy of exaltation and celebration.
I agree with that. In terms of the history's not going away. It's already happened. So it's not erasing anything. And actually, like I told you before, doing some of this research where I said, I know my first impression was, hey, we don't want to do this, right? Thinking of that Holocaust museum. But then I thought, I doing some of those research, pulling out some of those examples, I found out that a lot of those Confederate states and names of places and meaning like highways, roads, schools, and statues were actually put up after they lost that war, and it was sort of like to be like, hey, we're still, how they say the South will rise again, or so they actually did that purposely, not really because they thought maybe this road should really be named after this guy or whatever, but just to be like in defiance. So that begs the question. There's two thoughts to look. I don't think they named the roads to offend anybody. At that point, thinking about that, I thought to myself, well, since I believe like you do, history is not being erased because it's always there. It's just a matter of how we would teach it. Then if it really is bothersome to people, maybe it's okay.
Sorry, maybe it's okay. What
to change the names? I mean, for instance, I live in Clarksburg, Maryland, and my son's high school's name was Clarksburg High School. And I think to myself, wow, there's just nothing. Well, maybe someone will find Clark, the guy, because I am in Maryland and that is south of the Mason-Dixon line. Maybe one day someone will say, hey, that guy Clark who started this town was a bad dude. But as of right now, the high school up the road is in Damascus, Maryland, and it's named Damascus High School. I think that's really just a nice way to do things. And because if someone is really upset, even though to me, the name of my son's high school, as an example, never was important to me either way. I didn't care what it was. So I'm thinking to myself, if it is really important to someone and it's not important to me, you know what? Rename it.
Well, let me say one thing to that point, which I was just thinking about this as you were talking. I think this is kind of interesting. So people being offended, I understand and can appreciate that a Black American driving past a statue of Robert E. Lee, I could understand someone feeling aggrieved by that, feeling irritated by that, feeling offended by that. But that offense, I don't think is why we should be removing some of these statues. I think it's more about the values that we have as a country. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't remove the statues because they offend people. We should remove the statues because we want to create and build the most inclusive, respectful society that we can. Our goals should be lofty, and statues of Confederate generals don't really fit into that, given that the Confederacy was trying to maintain and defend the ownership of other human beings. And I realize, and this is maybe another part of the conversation, that times change, things change. There was a point in time where it was so ordinary for one human being to own other human beings. People were making decisions in that context, operating in that context.
What you're saying, I get it as far as the values of the country. And that begs the question to me, the renaming doesn't have a problem. I don't care whether if it offends someone or if it's the right thing to do for the country's values. I seem to notice a lot of the renaming ends up being for hey, we're going to rename it for someone who is African American or someone who was a slave or someone who
Well,
was.
I saw that in some of the examples you gave
Yeah,
earlier. Yeah.
sure. And to me, I'm like, well, okay, then it's like we're really just doing it for the people who are offended. Damascus, Maryland is the town. We're going to name the high school Damascus High School, and we're going to name the main street. It says it's in actuality, it's Main Street. That's very vanilla and fine.
Maybe that's good.
Yeah, I think it could be good. So, because, maybe why should we even attach any value? Does the name of a road or a building have to reflect the values of our country or of our society? And when I think about slavery and slave owners, I would just go to one thing that a lot of people don't consider, which doesn't make it any better. There weren't ships of Europeans landing on the shores of Africa and running in and grabbing people, like is sometimes depicted. In general, it was ships of Europeans docking and purchasing people from other people who had already captured and enslaved these people.
Who were those people?
Africans, other African people.
Mm-hmm. So the power dynamics in Africa resulted in that kind of human market where
it's still in some places in Africa, it's like that today. So yeah, it wasn't like, hey, we're going to go and, it was like a safari, like a hunting trip. It was a business. So, and it wasn't right. None of it was. And anywhere that slavery is going on today in the world still is not right. Obviously, that's just something to sort of think about. And when you think about it that way, you see how someone so far back in our history, who might have been a part of that and grew up from when they were a baby with that, it was normal to them. It was like, anything else that might be normal to us today. It was just part of the way things were.
Sure.
Now,
and there's plenty of normal things today that
sure
are obviously a terrible idea, and that they're just the status quo, and everyone kind of goes along with it.
And everyone figured it out now, and we figured it out with slavery, and at least in most places, that's not okay. So to get sort of back on track, if we're thinking about the actual renaming and removal, what does it accomplish in your eyes?
Well, so as I was saying before, I think it reframes the way we think about our shared values. It minimizes the glorification of wrongdoing and evil, or what we consider to be evil, although that definition changes as our history grows, stretches out behind us. And I think it is just more generally considerate of people whose ancestors were persecuted.
Okay. Yeah, I would think, what does it accomplish? There's two things it accomplishes right off the bat. It placates those and helps those who are offended by it. Two, it upsets people who don't want to do it. So it upsets the people on the right, the far right. It can accomplish, if we make those names more vanilla or more even, I do believe that it could maybe, let's just simmer people down.
Well, here's the question relating to that. And you might not know the answer to this. That's fine. This just occurred to me as you were talking. I wonder what the case would be for preserving a statue of Robert Lee, for example. I mean, I would be very interested to hear the case for that. Why?
I think I could answer that.
Okay.
I think, and because I know, like I said, I lean a little bit more to the right, and I know some people who lean very, very right. And I would bet you they would say something like, he was a great military general. He was a great strategist. He did incredible things with less resources, less money. I mean, the Confederacy did have less. They didn't have any of the economic boom and factory stuff up that was up north, because they did more of all the growing and the plantations. And they would say this was a great military mind, and he was from here. Now, I'm not saying that that's right, but I think that's what they would say. And they would liken that most likely to, if you have an actor, an author, an Olympian, a great sports person. Um, like people would say, hey, they're from here. Like I remember driving, I forget what state, but I was on an state somewhere in the, probably maybe Ohio, I'm not sure. But like I drove into this town and like on the bridge going over a river to the town, there was a sign. I remember this is a long time ago. It said home of Mary Lou Retton, right? Who was like a gymnastics Olympian.
Yeah, I remember her.
And so they're like, hey, this is our person. That she's from here. We're proud of it because she did something great. And I think that would be the argument, although I don't think it probably stands up too much, especially because I know you could probably just poke a hole right through it right now. But I think that's what they would say.
Yeah, I mean, Mary Lou Retton, to go to the Olympics and win a medal, obviously is a good thing. It's a virtuous thing.
Sure.
So I think, yeah, that's not really an apples to apples comparison.
Well, I know, and I think people's mind, they're thinking, listen, a soldier's a soldier, and a soldier's given orders and does things and has strategy and has to accomplish, and someone can be very accomplished, like, I'm not a huge history buff, but like Napoleon was apparently a pretty good general and a strategist, but was like, pretty much of a jerky person. So as an example, so you can be a bad person and still be good at something, I guess would be their argument. And I don't think that it's a great argument, but I think that's what someone would say. Um, if we think about this, they think, okay, I just told you through my research and through thinking about what we've talked about that I've come to the conclusion. Whereas if you asked me, a month ago, I'd say, well, no, we shouldn't do that. That's racing stuff, just without really thinking it through. Now I'm to the point, although it's not exactly where you are in terms of setting up sort of a value system with society, and sort of like mirroring that for where we want to be and where we think we should be. I'm okay with renaming them if people are really offended and it really is no skin off my back. And if that makes them happy and we can all get along a little bit better, then I say, okay, I get it. Especially when they can give me a reason. I want to rename this because this person did this person did that.
Sure.
So I can get with it. I'm good with that. But I just want to make sure, where does it end? Because even though you're talking about the value systems of society, a lot of people are just offended by these names. So where do we end? Because someone could be offended by Mary Lou Retton, and one day they take that sign down.
Yeah, but they're offended by the names. And I think they're offended by the societal celebrating of these figures who were ultimately on the wrong side of history. I mean, of course, the victor is the one that writes the history books, right? So
sure.
I don't think it's that people are offended by the name. I think they're offended by evil people being portrayed as heroes.
That makes sense. I understand what you're saying. One thing that makes me think of is that, if someone, like we said, was part of this society that everyone did this and they grew up in it, are they evil for just being a part of it? I think that's questionable to say. Someone's saying, hey, like, you're part of this society that we look back on and now we say, hey, that's wrong, and we've changed it. So everyone in the South who had anything to do with anything was an evil person. I think that I don't think you can go there. I don't.
Right. Well, that's what I was saying, as the context shifts over time. I mean, imagine a future wherein people do not kill and eat animals, where everybody is a vegetarian. That is the status quo. And they look back on this time when huge majorities of the population all around the world kills millions of chickens a year, millions of cattle a year, the beef industry, that's kind of an interesting way to frame up, I think, exactly what you're saying is like, does that mean that from the perspective of 200, 300 years in the future, looking back at this time, everyone that ate a hamburger was evil because it's so obvious to them that treating animals horribly and torturing them and keeping them confined in terrible conditions only to kill and eat them that's obviously a bad thing. But, people are going about their lives. You go to the grocery store, you see a half pound of ground beef, you put it in the cart, and you move on with your life. It's like it is interesting to think about it like that, to frame it up like that.
Yeah, and I think even, and that's sort of why I brought up that fact of where many of them, the slaves, came from. Like, oh, they were African people, other more powerful tribes. I mean, think of the movie Apocalypto, right? These are people just taking advantage of weaker groups with less numbers. They put war parties in and they say, we need to sacrifice because that's our religion. So many people a day. And we're just stealing people from the countryside who are too weak to fight us back. And obviously they didn't think they were evil. And it even makes it even muddier when you say, oh, so Black Africans overpowered weaker groups, got them together, made them slaves, and sold them to white Europeans and had a regular good old business going. That doesn't make it better, but it puts a different perspective on it, because think of those people, and then a kid who's born, raised on a plantation, and just grows up, and he's probably taken care of and raised partly by slaves, and then and it's just a thing, and then like he grows up, gets his own farm, and he has slaves. To him, yeah, of course, looking back, if you brought him to the future, he'd be, wow, maybe this is so wrong. But at the time, like, I just think we just can't call it evil. So if it's not for offense, it's sort of for people, like, these names need to be changed because they represent the spirit of something that we're past. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So are there boundaries? What I'm thinking about when I talk about boundaries now, in the spirit of what this embodies or portrays, this name of the school, this road, this statue, is not what we want to have as our value system and represent as what's a good thing to celebrate. So we'll change it. Okay. And plus I've already said, well, hey, listen, if someone's complaining, they're really offended and it's no skin off my back, go ahead. I'm not going to.
There's a difference between renaming a road, which is part of an infrastructure that needs to exist, and
Sure.
removing a statue. I mean, statues are decorative.
Sure.
They don't,
Sure. And so the statues can go too if they make people unhappy, or they don't portray the spirit, or they portray that spirit we don't want as part of our value systems. I'm fine either way. But so we talk about boundaries like that. That leads me to what I would say. I just said I'm okay with it, but exception wise, let's take Huckleberry Finn, removed from certain schools in certain places because there's portrayals of that inequity, right, between blacks and whites, and certain movies that people say, hey, we don't want this to show this movie. This isn't a good movie. I don't have an example of the movie now. I had the book, and there was, right now in Virginia, which is my neighbor state, school system, a school board, I believe it's Loudoun County. They're like, hey, this list of books were taken off because we think there's like sexual innuendos here, and we don't think it's right. And there's a big group of parents who are like, wait a minute now, you don't have to put it on the curriculum to read an English class, but you're just throwing them all out. That would be like, hey, there's this documentary that shows the concentration camps and the terrible things that happened there, that I remember seeing one when I was in high school in history class, which is terrible. You're like, oh my gosh, it's like the worst footage. And people say, don't show that, close it down, get rid of those, because it depicts that, and we don't want to. So I think there are boundaries in art. I would say books, movies, music. The Maryland state song is being worked on by some groups to be removed now, because when it was written, Maryland, my Maryland, there's some reference to something somewhere in there that people are like, hey, that's offensive, that goes too far.
I would be very curious to know what it is that people are offended with. It's hard to say, not knowing what the lyrics of the song are, but I'd be curious to hear them.
Yeah, I think a little research. I'm bringing this up sort of off of the cuff here, but I just thought of exceptions: movies, books, music. If someone says, "Hey, we shouldn't," that should be banned. Hey, we can change the name. We can, and what they're doing with most of these these statues, from what I've heard, they're not like melting them down. They're moving them somewhere else. Sometimes private people have said, well, I'll purchase it, or they're relocating in many cases, except for one that like some protesters have knocked down or whatever. But so I just think that the boundaries within the, hey, this depicts a culture of something that we don't want as one of our values. I think we have to let art exist with that, even if it's sometimes ugly. And there's as well, there's a book, I can't remember it now, but that I was just talking about with a woman at work who, she said that it is worked on being banned in her school, because it was West Side Story. And you think, what? Well, because the scene where it's an innuendo in the musical that the antagonist's sister comes to send a message and is raped. Although in the play, and they're like, we can't have that. We don't want the high school to put that on the drama, because that includes that anyone who's seeing that, it's sort of saying like they wouldn't give the message, they didn't do it. And I don't know if you've ever seen that musical, but there's sort of like an innuendo that if you're smart, you're like, oh, like they assaulted her.
I've never seen it, but interestingly, I would draw a comparison to the movie Grease and the stage play of Grease, which is also absolutely loaded with the same type of. There's a lot of innuendo in there that suggests
like date rape type of thing.
Yeah.
West Side Story, you should see it. It's excellent. The movie is excellent. And the new one coming out, I had heard from some right-leaning people that, hey, they're changing everything. They're really politically correcting
everything is political now.
Yeah. And so I was like, why would they do that? But I've recently seen some commercials for it. It's coming out December 10th. And with what I've seen so far, I was like, looks like a white Irish guy and a Puerto Rican young woman, and they're falling in love. And I was like, this looks like the old movie. I'll give it a whirl to see. Because there were people saying, oh, they're gonna take it away and make it different people and put some transgenders and put some homosexuals in there and try to mix it up. And I was like, well, that story was so good, I don't know if you have to do all that, right? There's already a bunch in there that talks about social acceptance and the different cultures and everything. So
yeah, that would almost be it's another version of the story, right? Very kind of extreme modifications.
In which West Side Story is another version of Romeo and Juliet. People used to think, Elvis was a terrible, crazy person when he first started dancing on stage. And now, I mean, that's so tame, it's almost laughable to what we have now.
That is really funny.
So I think just art, if there's something that you're not forced to sit and look at every day, I think it is what it is.
So is there anything that's off limits in art? Because, to bring it back to the German example, you're not allowed to paint swastikas in Germany and call it art.
Yeah. That makes me think of the, there was some depiction at one of these New York art places with like Christ doing something really weird. And it was pretty, I think there's no limits to me, but I look at that example and I'm like, that's tasteless and it's bad. So no, I wouldn't go to that art show. So I don't think you can put a limit on it unless someone's actually being hurt and it's against their will. They're like, I don't want to be involved in this art. Right. And you're like, no, you're going to be in this movie. Okay. That's wrong. But if it's depictions and everyone's agreeing and being a part of it, hey, we want to do this movie. And, I think it's all right. Is there any harm that occurs from these removals? What do you think about that?
I think that any harm that may occur from removing a statue or renaming a road is likely much less than the harm of human societies refusing to redefine what it means to be good, heroic, noble, or worthy of celebration and making those adjustments.
I think that the only thing that I could label right now at harm from renaming a school, for instance, is that someone gets upset because they liked it or but I don't think that's really harm. It's it's just sort of almost someone saying, well, I don't want it to change because I just don't want to agree with that with you, you know?
Yeah. I mean, so maybe, and I think you mentioned this before, maybe there's an element of like people's identity gets wrapped up in these things, like if there was a school called Robert E. Lee Elementary, I don't know that such a thing exists, but I could see someone who lives in that town, who goes to that school, whose parents went to, some sense of like, it's been this way for a long time and I see no reason to change it. He was a brilliant tactician, et cetera. But you have to hold that up against the Black student that has to go to school there and has to walk through the doors every morning, knowing that the place is named for a guy that had slaves and was fighting to maintain slavery. And I think that's a very interesting lens to look through.
Sure. No, I agree. I think you have to take into account the amount, right? The amount of harm. So if someone says, oh, harm, I'm upset, or me, I'm truly offended and I'm made to feel minimized because of it. At the end of the day, to me, the name of a school doesn't make a difference. Really, are they teaching the kids? Or does everyone feel included and able to have the opportunity to learn? That's what's important at a school. And in a road, is it in good shape? Can we drive on it, get where we need to go?
Where I live, the answer to that question is universally no. The roads are terrible.
So would there be any benefit for just keeping everything as it is? I think we sort of touched on this, but I mean, I think the benefit I could see would be we'd save some money.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's posterity. There is the society as a landscape of everything that came before and how we got here. We can have statues of these Confederate figures. It doesn't mean that people don't understand the history.
Sure. I mean, Auschwitz still stands as an example, but now it's maybe, take these statues and do display them in an area, a little park area where you can walk through and say, these are examples of some of the statues that were put up in the South after they lost and were crying about it and felt bad.
That's actually a really interesting idea. And not to keep pointing at Germany, but that's essentially what they have there. And you go to these socialist museums and you see all the Nazi memorabilia. It's like, there's a specific place for that. No one has to go to the socialist museum, but you can go and you can read about Germany's role and the rise of the Nazi party and how that whole thing transpired. And that history is there for the absorbing.
Yeah. And I think when we talk about benefits, like to learn and to remember in a certain context, we're like, okay, I'm entering Auschwitz. I'm entering the Holocaust Museum. I'm entering this Confederate History Museum that's showing me on Gettysburg Battlefield, part of what they were about. And then right next to it is the Union one, right? So I don't have a problem with that because people know, hey, I'm going for this learning experience, and they're going to show me the truth, not just what, people who watch CNN or Fox want to know. They're going to show me, here's what it was like back then. And I can ponder on it, learn by it, say, wow, can't believe that ever happened. I'm glad that's over and we'll never do that again. And we can move on. So I agree with that. But keeping things as they are, just on the street, on the school, the only benefit would be to save a little bit of money, because it costs a little bit of money to take one sign down and put another one up.
Tax dollars.
There we go. That's about it. So I think we've come close to this one in saying sort of, even though I think we're both okay with it, maybe for a little bit different reasons. My final thoughts are that this, even from starting from the research, has been a journey for me in terms of, I never thought, I remember bringing this up when we were talking about a list of topics. I never thought that I would end up saying, I'm okay with it if it really bothers people, because it's no skin off my back. And I understand some of the reasons some of those things were actually put up and named for that was sort of in defiance of all that, which makes it even, that much easier for me to be able to brush it to the side. So when it comes to the end of the day, if someone's really upset or offended because that represents a portrayal of a certain societal value that we don't want to support in any way, then I'm fine with the renamings and the removals, because history is not being erased. And we could take steps to make sure that people, know what happened, without having it depend on the name of a school or a road, or without a statue being in front of a courthouse, which is supposed to represent justice.
Yeah, well said. I agree with you. And I would just add that I think there's an element to this that I keep kind of going back to, which is right and wrong is not that difficult to figure out. It's wrong to own other human beings, and people that did that should not be celebrated with heroic statues.
Even though that we both agreed contextually, we're not saying everybody who lived back then in that situation was an evil person, but the last sentence you just said, agreed.
Okay, guys, thanks for listening. Keep an eye out for the next episode. If you have an idea for a topic you'd like to hear discussed, drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this discussion and you'd like to hear more balanced conversations, go ahead and hit subscribe. We would really appreciate it.
This is Steve.
And this is Ben.
And we are balanced.